All right, guys, welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be looking at the Florida State Seminoles and the potential path to repeating as going undefeated as they did in 2023. Here in 24, a lot of new things going on in college football, playoff expansion, something that would certainly have benefited them just a couple of months ago. A new look ACC as well. A lot of changes are going on, Nick. Want to put a cap on 2023 before we look ahead to the positives for the Noles in 2024 and why they can still be a contender in college football. 13-0 start. They beat Louisville in the conference championship game, won games by a 19-point per game average. They're left out of the college football playoff, Nick, and we're going to discuss if we thought that was fair or not. And of course, we've already talked about this before, but I think this is the finishing touches we'll put on what was still a very successful season for the Seminoles. You know, November 18th, Jordan Travis got hurt against an FCS opponent. They had 2 games to prove that quarterback was not a liability for them against Florida and Louisville. 424 total yards across those 2 games, less than 4 yards per play in both of those contests. They did not answer that question, Nick. They did not prove that quarterback was not a liability for them. Offense was abysmal. I mean, they had some guys step up that allowed them to, really as a team, collectively stepped up that allowed them to win those 2 games right. But going into the college football playoff, it just seems like it would have been a big waste of everybody's time. Alabama played Michigan incredibly tough, took them to overtime, lost on a 4th down stop. I mean, you can't get any closer than that, right? And just Florida State, it seems like it would have been an abomination of a showing if they were going to the playoff, even though I think they probably could have competed closer than some people thought. I think winning certainly would have been out of the question as they were down to, a 3rd-string quarterback.
Before I share my thoughts on whether or not Florida State, deserved to be in the playoffs, I do have to say, I did go to the University of Alabama. I am alumnus of that university. So obviously Alabama getting the playoffs over Florida State certainly benefited me and my alma mater and, in my fandom. Overall, though, I think Florida State, getting left out was the right decision. I think they certainly could have been competitive, like you said. I don't think they could have beaten Michigan. I think Michigan would have won the game probably by, 3 scores by the end of it, but it certainly could have been competitive in the first half. When you look at Florida State as a whole, this was a great season without what happened at the end, right? When you look at it, Florida State was down in the dumps with Willie Taggart, and they really were struggling in the post-Jimbo Fisher era. They really seemed like they had no direction. Mike Norvell came in, and early on they had no direction. They lost to, at the time, FCS, Jacksonville State at home. They looked like an absolute complete dumpster fire team. But in that game 2 years ago where they took Notre Dame down to the wire opening weekend, you started to see them trend in the right direction. I know they lost to Jacksonville State not too long after that, but still they were sort of putting the pieces together of building a right program. Mike Norvell is a hell of a coach. He really deserved that extension, is a fantastic leader for this program. That win over LSU was a very exciting way to start the season. I do think there were some cracks in this team in other games. They struggled against Boston College on the road. They did not look fantastic on the road at Pitt. Certainly in that was a later season contest. The struggles against Florida and Louisville without a quarterback made the selection of them out of the playoff, clear to me. And I think that was what should have happened. You can continue to make the case all you want. I think it was fair they left out of the playoff. Obviously now, nowadays it's a moot point with the expanded playoff. And when you look at this Florida State roster that we're going to get into, they can certainly have a chance to make a run at this expanded playoff.
Yeah, and I certainly, just because you went undefeated does not mean that's a guaranteed automatic bid. And obviously they can't help that their quarterback went down. And, the players would make the argument, we're more than just a quarterback. And I mean, yeah, you're right. But at the same time, you guys, Ohio State many years ago, they had proved that quarterback was not a liability for them. They went by 60 points in their conference championship game, and they went on to win the national championship. We're talking 2 complete different cases here, Nick. Anybody who wanted to bring up Cardale Jones, I thought it was just a foolish conversation because they proved that question, and they did it better than anybody had to win all season. And Florida State didn't come anywhere close to that, struggled to even pick up a first down in those 2 games. Again, collective efforts to get over the hump and pick up those victories. But they did not answer that question even close, and they even try to mention the Buckeyes all the way, those years back. It should not have been a conversation.
I totally agree. I think that was a bad comparison that people were making. When you look at that Ohio State team, that was a team that was a really strong team that had a good roster outside of their quarterback play. When you look at that team, yes, they lost to Virginia Tech at home out of conference, but in conference play, they were very dominant across the board. They beat down on Rutgers. They beat down on Illinois. They had a great game against Minnesota and Michigan State back-to-back ranked weeks. With those teams, they beat a good Penn State team on the road in double overtime, right? They had earned the right, and like you said, they beat Wisconsin 59-0 with a third-string quarterback. That certainly put the stamp on it for me and made it very obvious that this team deserved to be in the playoffs at that point. They went on and ended up winning a national championship, upsetting Alabama and going all the way. When you look at that team, JT Barrett getting injured and the other injuries that team suffered, Cardell Jones stepped in, and Cardell Jones was just a fantastic. But Braxton Miller was the other quarterback they replaced. Cardell Jones was an outlier. He was better than most third-string quarterbacks on any single roster, better than most second-string quarterbacks on any roster at that point in time. He's such a talented player that they had just waiting in the wings. I think comparing the two situations would be a foolish comparison that people were making. This was a completely separate set of circumstances here, and Florida State did not get a raw deal, in my opinion.
I certainly think that we wanted this team to make the playoffs with Jordan Travis. We both picked them to make it in the preseason. Obviously, we're rooting for that prediction to be accurate. I thought that they, at full strength, would have been a very good team that could have won the national championship game, and it's just an unfortunate draw that they had. And I certainly think you can't take anything away from how good this team was. And that kind of leads you to the next conversation here. They played Georgia in the Orange Bowl. I picked them to lose 45-0 in this game. Didn't think it'd be close with all the opt-outs. Nobody wanted to play for Florida State in this bowl game. They fielded a team that was probably worse than that 2018 Willie Taggart team that went 5-7, Nick, to be quite honest with you, with the underclassmen and the guys who were deep on the depth chart playing. Lost to a Georgia team that themselves came up just shy of the playoffs. They were at full strength. They only had one or two opt-outs, if that. A hungry Georgia team that absolutely blew them out of the water. And this proved absolutely nothing, Nick. It did not justify anything that they said. A lot of unnecessary disrespect, maybe a little bit of trolls. And I know Kirk Herbstreit, he's been even recently trying to defend himself for his take that we also agreed with. But some of it isn't trolls, Nick. Some of these people actually believe that Florida State could not have competed with Georgia if they were at full strength. And I mean, the lone starter that didn't play on that defense was Patrick Payton. Forces a fumble on the third play of the game, Nick. I mean, that right there kind of just sums up that these guys would have been competitive. I certainly think that Florida State could have took Georgia for 4 quarters at full health. Obviously, nobody played for them one bit. Lost the game by 60 points. I don't think this is indicative of the year they had one bit, though. This is still a very good Florida State team, and the circumstances they were under here was not very good for them one bit, and a blowout was expected.
I think it certainly is not a result that shows the full picture for the full season, but I do think I said it back then, I said it now. I think it was embarrassing how many opt-outs that Florida State had. I know in the transfer portal NIL era, this is what happens. Opt-outs across the board are very common, but Florida State lost their entire roster. I think they should have played with some pride. Go out there and if you go out there and beat Georgia, you can say, hey, we deserve to be in there. We proved it. I think about it. UCF got snubbed from the playoffs. They were unbeaten. Some people thought they should have been in over Alabama that year. That, again, I don't think that would have been the right choice, but a group of 5 team in. But they didn't care. They went out and beat Auburn in the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, and they showed that, hey, look, we cared. We put the effort in. If you're Florida State, in my opinion, you should have gone out and put your roster together and gone and won that game. I think that skipping it was just a ludicrous opinion and was an embarrassment, because then you end up losing by 60 and getting absolutely run off the field and making a complete fool of yourself on national television in a joke. Florida State fans saying they were boycotting the game. I just think it was dumb. You should have gone out and played the damn game, put your players out there on the field, and prove to the committee, hey, we deserve to be in. We beat Georgia, one of the best teams in the country up to that point. I think it was just a bad look all over the place, and speaks to a larger issue with bowls, bowl opt-outs, the NIL transfer portal, all the issues plaguing college football right now that I'm not going to jump on my soapbox and talk about here. I just think that it was handled poorly across the board, and Florida State, they got blown out, they got embarrassed, and that's just how it's going to end up. That was how it ended up. It's embarrassing, in my opinion, and it puts a sour taste in the end of what was a great season where they won the ACC and came back to prominence. College football is better when Florida State's good, in my opinion. They're one of the premier programs in the nation. And for them to kind of end their season like that, I thought was just a poor, poor way to end it.
Yeah, I certainly understand that take, Nick. They should have went out there and tried to prove some more respect. I'm not really upset for them for not wanting to play in that game. I think they lost, a big desire to play in that season finale when they got, snubbed of the playoffs. So I can certainly understand it from that point of view. But that's what ended up happening at the end of the day. That's kind of the game they played, was to not play, and ended up in a lot of disrespect thrown towards this team. But I think that one thing Norvell and all those players understand is this team certainly could have went head-to-head with anyone in the country. The effort they put on against Louisville in offense, it's pretty good, right? Jack Plummer is obviously an interesting player for the most part, but that's still a very good offense. They held to 188 yards on 70 plays, 6 points in a game that Louisville certainly should have won. Elite domination on defense all the way back in week 1 against LSU, dominated them in the second half. The Heisman Trophy winner was held in check in the second half. He had like a 70-yard touchdown in garbage time. That was it. So this is a defense that certainly could have competed at full strength. I think with Jordan Travis in this offense, they certainly would have been more than formidable. So I think that kind of just puts a cap on that, Nick. I certainly think this 2023 season was very successful. Just an unfortunate sequence of events there that led to them not being able to make the playoffs. I think it was the right choice, but I definitely want people to remember how talented this team was, and I certainly think, especially with that defensive line, Jared Verse, Braden Fiske, those guys are both going to be top 50 selections, and that's just two guys, Nick, on what was a very talented roster. So I certainly think that the disrespect being thrown towards them for losing by 60 points proves absolutely nothing, and that's not a good point to try and back up the committee. I think the one that we made about the quarterback and the questions being, not answered, that's a real formidable opinion, not them losing to Georgia in the Orange Bowl.
I totally agree. I think it is a very fair assessment that we gave this team at the end of the year. Still a successful year, right? Won the ACC, undefeated regular season, a lot of progress compared to where they were in the Willie Taggart era. It's a nice turnaround, right? And you can build on that here with the transfer portal, NIL, and all those things. Florida State can certainly build on that heading into this season.
Now looking ahead to this season, the positives for them, they're returning key components and potentially winning a lot more games to be back in this position in 2024. This is a revamped offensive line. Remember under Jimbo Fisher and even in the Taggart era, these guys were awful on the offensive front. And, they get 4 starters back essentially. They don't lose too much. And I think this is certainly something that's highly beneficial for them, as this is going to be, kind of the building block for this offense. Jeremiah Byers, he was one of the biggest adds in the portal last year. Struggled a little bit at right tackle in the bumping competition, but I think a player of his caliber, he's going to have a very sound season now that he has a year under his belt. Keandre Jones, guard with some nice size on that right side for them. Maurice Smith, another senior who's back. You're going to put Darius Washington at left tackle, who played about 350 snaps or so at left tackle. He's going to be the full-time starter for them now. You lose Casey Roderick at left guard. Dimitri Emmanuel, he was also a guard for them who played a solid bit. TJ Ferguson looks like he's going to be the one new guy they insert. But for the most part, this is a senior-led offensive line, Nick, and I think that's a good starting point for Florida State that does lose a lot on this side of the ball.
It's a very strong offensive line here of some great leaders. Darius Washington at left tackle can really break out and be a good leader here. I think full-time position at tackle works for him on that left side. TJ Ferguson has a lot of potential. Center depth is a little concerning, but Maurice Smith is a good physical center there who has a good grasp of snapping the ball and solid and blocking. Kadarian Jones and Jeremiah Byers on the right side are 2 strong tackles as well. This is a really good leadership unit here, right? You got all these returning starters and seniors who are veterans in the ACC now. I think this bodes well for this Florida State offense.
Yeah, I certainly think that this is a group that's come a long way. I think they're going to take another step this upcoming season. And you look at the supporting cast. This is a group that's also got to replace a lot of guys. We'll get to the transfers here shortly, where we'll talk about Malik Benson. But one of the silver linings of all those starters not playing and opting out for the Orange Bowl has allowed some of these other guys that are coming back for this season to get a lot of meaningful reps. The weeks leading up to the Orange Bowl, they got first team reps, and then of course in the game they all played a good bit. Guys like Darian Williamson, Ja'Kai Douglas, 5-star Hakeem Williams got to play. Quinturion Poitier, he played. He had 84 yards on 4 receptions. He was really making a point early on in that game. These are some guys that really impressed. Kyle Morlock as well didn't play much last season, but he's going to be a tight end's got more unique size, who got on the field for some snaps, didn't have a box score, but at 6'6", 240, a guy I think they certainly are happy with. One of those players they picked up in last year's portal. This is a supporting cast that has some meaningful experience now, but can they compete with the big dogs is going to be the biggest question. You're not going to have guys like Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman. I think these are all respectable players, but some of these guys like Douglas and Portier, they're seniors, right? And even though they have that experience, they've never been meaningful plays rather. But stepping out in the Orange Bowl like Portier did, that's certainly something that's highly notable. And I think that this is a group that can certainly compete with some of the higher ups in the conference, but from a nationwide standpoint, that remains to be proven.
Ja'Kai Douglas is a really solid player, 14 grabs, 243 yards receiving at 17.4 yards per grab. In his limited appearances, I like what I've seen out of him. Keitron Portier, a solid player, 136 yards receiving across the season for him. He's a solid player that has some, potential to grow in this passing attack. I think he's a really solid player. He had 84 yards receiving in that game against Georgia, so he got some good looks there. Douglas had some carried the ball a fair amount as well in the game against Georgia, so there are some potential there for those 2 players to go. I think both of them are solid. I think Morlock's a great tight end, a good prototypical tight end that has a lot of potential there. Solid player top to bottom. Akeem Williams is a really solid player, former 5-star, has a ton of potential. Didn't see really anything of him as a true freshman last year. He's going to step in and be, involved this year. He did have a touchdown last year and five receptions across the season, so he could step up and be a big player. They made some work in the portal as well. They were going to highlight on offense, adding a pair of former Alabama stars, plus a new quarterback that can certainly help out this offense.
Yeah, I certainly think this is not a bad supporting cast to have, but the word I was trying to find was meaningful production in the pass. I think that's a good way to put it. 11 of the team's 25 receiving touchdowns came from Keon Coleman last year, also led them in receptions and yards. So a lot of shoes to certainly fill. Be interesting to see what happens. Lawrence Tafali, he's one of the lone returnees in this backfield. He had 463 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's a very admirable player for them, over 6 yards per carry. Has been a nice receiver in the past. He's had 20-plus receptions the last 2 seasons, so not a bad point right there for them. I think this is a pretty formidable offense. Again, Nick, competing with the big dogs remains to be seen. The defense gets a star back at each level of the field is the biggest news for them. Again, this is a defense I'm going to beat for the end of time on the table. They could have competed with anyone in the country last year, but now you have to replace a lot of those guys, especially on the defensive front. Patrick Payton originally was going to be in the portal. Looks like he's pulling out. He's going to stay in Tallahassee. Joshua Farmer, a nice defensive tackle there in the middle for them. These are more so some veterans they're getting back, but in terms of what star they get back at each level, Patrick Payton on the D-line, DJ Lundy in the middle, and then Fentrell Cypress at cornerback. These are some impactful players they're getting back, Nick. Obviously, when we do our full breakdown, we'll kind of talk about some of these other guys, players like Greedy Vance, Shaheem Brown that have been around a long time, Darrell Jackson on the D-line. This is a unit that was very good last season, Nick. Very impressive stuff that they have, being able to continue to, bring some of these guys back. Certainly impressive. I think it was Lundy who was in the portal for a little bit, opts the return. Some big news for them. Fentrell Cypress was one of the top-ranked portal ads from last year's cycle. So I think this is certainly a defense that can compete at a high level. Obviously, again, we'll still do a full breakdown later, but I think right now, kind of like the offense, with their offensive line, what this defense has, the core in place, I think they can compete.
I think this is a great defense that returns from talented players. Patrick Payton, getting him back off that left side is just an absolutely incredible return for this team. 44 total tackles, 14.5 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, and 10 pass breakups. He could do it all. Forced 2 fumbles as well, Payton, including some other in the towards the end of the season. He is such a talented player. When you return him, there's a lot of potential of him. He's such a talented speedster. I really like what you can see at him in Fentrell Cypress as well. 40 total tackles for him returning, plus 8 pass breakups. So he's a really good player in that secondary unit, a great leader for this team at left cornerback. I really like what they have on that left side there with Payton and Cypress. These are 2 really talented players they're returning. This defense is so talented, right? This defense had a lot of talent last year. They were very productive. They're pumping out guys to the NFL. They continue to do so. That's been a key staple right now. The Mike Norvell era is, pumping out really talented defensive players. Yes, they're going to have to replace a lot of those guys, but next man up mentality on defense has been sort of this transition for this team as they get better over the last couple of years. And this defense is producing some seriously talented players. They return talented players. They brought in some talented transfers. Expect this defense to be just as good, if not better, than it was last year.
Patrick Payton last year led the team with 14.5 tackles for a loss. They also had 7 sacks, 10 pass breakups from an edge player, Nick. That's absurd. There's some really good players here. DJ Lundy's been around a long time. Certainly hasn't been the most productive player, but when you play in that great trio of linebackers, that's certainly expected. A guy who's a very disciplined player, good tackler there. And then, of course, Cypress last year was a big addition for what was, I believe, the top-ranked pass defense. So this is still a defense that needs to get a lot of love, and I think as we march towards the fall, it certainly will. And kind of the last point that's a good returning key component for them, this is going to go somewhat unspoken, but the entire staff was retained, Nick. Not a single person opted to explore other opportunities. The return Alex Akins and Adam Fuller, the 2 coordinators. This is big news for them. We just glazed up the defense a good bit with, what Adam Fuller's been able to do. That's big news that he's back. Akins as well on the offensive side, and obviously it was a big struggle for him without his top quarterback, and that's something they're certainly have to figure out. Life without Jordan Travis Wright. And I think the offense at times left a lot to be desired. But this is insane cohesiveness that they're returning. A team that went 13-0, doesn't lose a single, again, they don't lose a single coach to anybody. Mike Norvell doing a great job keeping the wheels on the bus, really, because it seemed like the whole world fell apart when they got left out of the playoffs. Nobody plays in the Orange Bowl. All hell could have broke loose, Nick, and Mike Norvell has done a great job of keeping things together. Some that's not going to go talked about much, right, but I think this is massive news.
In the era of NIL and transfer portal where teams seem to change overnight, having staff continuity is a massive leg up on the competition. Keeping your two coordinators, especially keeping Norvell, there was smoke and rumors about him potentially interested in the Alabama job. Whether or not that was anything serious or was just a ploy to get that big extension, who really knows truly. But if that was true, they ended up keeping Norvell, who was building quite the program in Tallahassee. He keeps his bottom staff there with him. A lot of talented young coordinators and other coaches on the staff that they return really helps with recruiting, helps bring in a stable team all around you. This is a very big thing for Florida State to keep this stability.
Moving to the final slide here. The title is, somewhat underwhelming portal class. The only reason I say that is because they did such a good job last year. The expectation is certainly high, right? I'm not saying this is a negative by any means, but they, were able to add a lot of X factors over the past couple of years. They certainly have here, but not really that most common fans will know, right? Obviously, a lot of people know DJ Uyunglele started at Clemson, went to Oregon State. He's back here in this South region. This is a quarterback we certainly have, mixed opinions on. I think this is a big-bodied quarterback who moves very well for his size, has shown the ability to be aggressive downfield. He's a good athlete who has great experience, nice arm strength, really thrives in the intermediate game. Biggest problem with Uyunglele is the accuracy isn't all that impressive. He misses open targets. He'll be late on one route, doesn't always layer the ball with precision. Just a player that lacks consistency, and Aiken's obviously going to have to do a lot with him. This is a player I don't think that they can really get to the next level with. I think he's a nice bridge for the future, though. They certainly would have loved to have a player like this last year when Travis went down, but I think overall they're downgrading at quarterback, Nick. If he can showcase that consistency, though, they can certainly have a good starter, on their offense at quarterback. But if he doesn't, it's going to be a big problem for Florida State.
DJ Uyunglele did not have a great time when he was in the ACC previously. Was kind of the scapegoat at Clemson. I think that was, very unfair. I thought he was a really talented quarterback, obviously a former 5-star. Seemed to refine that sort of touch at Oregon State. We talked about this in a previous episode talking about the transfer quarterbacks. Some of the stats, though, at Oregon State weren't as impressive on paper as you thought they were in the naked eye when you watched them play. Will the play transition well back to the ACC? I think that the level of play in the Pac-12 is less than it was in the ACC. Certainly benefit from that. Can he find, that sort of groove and really get to those heights that we expect him out of high school? I don't know if he can at this point in time. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt because I've always given DJ the benefit of the doubt. I think he's a really talented, raw player. If he can hit those heights that he was expected out of high school, this offense could be high-flying and producing a lot of points with the schedule they're facing, but it's a big if. Can he produce at a high level? I think that's yet to be seen to the level that you expect out of DJ. Will he step up? The parts around him, they're good, but they're not phenomenal. It's going to be very interesting to see how he adjusts to this return to the ACC.
Joining Tuafali in that backfield, Jalen Lucas and Roydell Williams. Williams, a veteran Alabama power back. Lucas, a guy who certainly should have gotten a lot more touches in Indiana. I watched a good bit of Hoosier football this past season for betting purposes. He only had, about 500 total yards and 4 touchdowns. It seemed every time he was touching the ball, he was an impact performer. And I think this is a guy who, at 5'9", 170, has plenty of explosiveness, has shown the ability to be a game changer, just didn't always get to work for Indiana. I think that he can be a nice piece for this offense as a pass catcher and a runner. Williams, obviously he's going to bring some leadership, I think. And, you see a lot of Alabama on this slide. Malik Benson, there's been some great reports out of him having a strong spring. Was never really a big player for the Tide, but so far for Florida State, he's having a great offseason. Loving what I'm hearing from Tallahassee. Terrence Ferguson, somewhat of a shocking departure there for Alabama. A guy who is a really good guard, a nice run blocker for them. I think that this is going to be a good addition for them, along with Richie Leonard, leaving the Gators to go to his former rival, Florida State, a guy who also brings plenty of leadership to the table. I think there's some nice upside here, alongside those guys we already talked about returning. I think this is going to be a nice opportunity for this offensive line to really blossom with these additions.
I like some of the ads here. I think Roydell Williams is a really underrated back, great power back. I loved him in Tuscaloosa. I was disappointed to see him leave. I thought he was a good veteran in the locker room. Malik Benson, a lot of untapped potential, a really talented wide receiver. Didn't quite figure it out in Tuscaloosa. That is a great opportunity to do so. The 2 offensive linemen ads, right, Ferguson and Leonard. Where do they plug in? Are they going to get reps early on? Can they find a way to plug in, Ferguson at left guard? You'd expect him to be the starter at left guard. He's a very strong physical player, good veteran, has got some good experience. Leonard as well, a solid player. Jalen Lucas, a really underrated back from Indiana. I think that's a great ad. This is a small class, a weaker class than last year, but these are still guys that can have impacts early on in their specialty different roles.
I do want to clarify, Ferguson didn't have many snaps at Alabama, but 3 years in Nick Saban's locker room, certainly you're going to bring some leadership that is going to be beneficial to this football team. So overall, I think these are some nice additions for this offense. They keep them up to speed, Nick. You know what that means is, some good depth, established quality of players. That's kind of what you look for sometimes. You're not always gunning for the highest players available in the portal. Sometimes doing something like this, getting a nice pass catcher can be a starter, some nice running backs who can provide something in the rotation, experienced offensive linemen. That's a pretty good class in Florida State. Certainly nowhere near as exciting as last year's, right? Tough standard to follow up. And they kind of did the same on the defensive side of the ball. Marvin Jones Jr., former 5-star, never really played at Georgia. Could be a big-time addition for them. A lot of shoes to fill on their D-line. Jared Verse, of course, departing. They're going to need a guy who can step in and be strong off the edge. Grady Kelly from Colorado State. This is a guy who was, really good in the Mountain West for Colorado State. This was a team that obviously wasn't very notable for people in college football, but Grady Kelly, as a sophomore, had 6.5 TFLs, 35 tackles. Certainly want to continue to see him bulk up in size. Could be a nice quality addition to their defensive line, having success in the group of 5 in the past. Obviously, Braden Fiske. Siani Lola, he from Oregon State. Obviously, this is him stepping out of his comfort zone, going all the way out west, following his former teammate DJ out here to Tallahassee. That's certainly going to be something for him. But again, if all the shoes to fill, Nick, this has got to be the optimal place for guys who were able to be quality performers for their team a season ago. He was a nice player for the Beavers. And I don't really know too much about Earl Weddle. I know a lot of people were, kind of excited that he was going to Florida State. I quite frankly don't know much about him, Nick, coming from Alabama.
I know Earl Little, he's a solid player in Tuscaloosa. I don't know him very well, but I do have heard of him. He impressed a lot in practices. He was a popular guy in Tuscaloosa that really had the potential to be a star in the secondary. He ends up jumping over here to Florida State. I think this works out for him. He's going to get reps early on, a really talented player. He could have had reps in Tuscaloosa with the way things shaked out. He could have stepped up, but he ends up making the move to Tallahassee. I think this works out well for him. Marvin Jones Jr., a really solid edge rusher out of UGA. I think he's got some real opportunity to step up. Grady Kelly as well from Colorado State. A lot of potential with Kelly. He can make that transition. I think he's up to the speed to make that transition, make the jump to the ACC, a very talented player. These 4 adds are very solid guys that could have early on nice impact and potential for this team.
They added a few more on defense as well, but these are really the standouts. Lola, he from Oregon State, 8.5 TFLs last year. So again, some quality performers. They're able to add on both sides of the ball. I think that's really impressive for them. They're able to do that. Find established players. They try and fill some of the shoes here. You're looking at this 2024 Florida State schedule. Obviously, they're going to open up the year in Dublin against Georgia Tech, a team that obviously exceeded expectations a season ago. They played Boston College after that. Get an early bye week. You see teams like Memphis, Cal, Clemson's on there. They play at SMU. At Miami's going to be interesting. At Notre Dame, November 9th. And, of course, you'll end the season hosting your rival. This is a schedule pretty comparable to last year, Nick. Some tough teams on here. The Yellow Jackets, the 2 Tiger teams, Memphis and Clemson. And then the Hurricanes as well. Obviously, the Irish are going to be tough. Schedule is pretty comparable to last season, Nick. You don't have the out-conference stunner like you did with, LSU. But I think this is a pretty tough schedule. And if they were to go undefeated here, they would certainly be in the playoffs, I think, this time around. But I think they would certainly make more of a statement than they did last year if he was on this schedule.
This decent schedule, right? At opening up in Dublin, those games are always very interesting. They can sometimes be wonky. That's gonna be a tough matchup. Georgia Tech's, they're no slouch as a team that has some potential out there. Should have a good crowd out there. A great opening, week 0 kickoff game. For them to be playing out there, I think is really cool. They get that Monday night game on week 1. The Monday night game is always a fun game for me on Labor Day weekend. Last year we saw Duke and Clemson battle out in a great game. This Boston College team, they have a new coach with Bill O'Brien, so they could be a total wild card here. That game could be very close. Memphis at a conference is a very interesting matchup. That's a team that, Mike Norvell's former team, very interesting matchup there. Then you got the 2 conference newcomers in Cal and SMU. SMU's a team I'm very interested to see what they look like this year. That could be a very interesting matchup. You play Notre Dame, you play Clemson, you play North Carolina, Duke, all really talented teams. Duke a little bit less, obviously, having just lost their head coach. And then in Florida, we don't really know what to expect out of Florida. They got a tough schedule themselves out there, but you host them this year. This is an interesting schedule. I like this schedule for Florida State here. There's a lot of good teams on it. At Notre Dame is definitely going to be a tough matchup, certainly. You get Clemson at home, a team they beat last year on the road. That's a tough matchup still as well. This team could find themselves in the playoffs. They could run the table if everything kind of works out the right way. They have a talented roster to do so, in my opinion. It's a very favorable schedule, lacking that sort of big punch in non-conference like you said with LSU last year. It's a manageable schedule, in my opinion. They could certainly run the table if they get hot.
That's going to be it for today's episode. As always, Nick, appreciate you joining me breaking down the Noles. Bit of a team that's certainly a lot of sourness left in their mouth, but I think there's still a lot for them to be proud of, and I think that's certainly something Mike Norvell is going to continue to preach to them.
It's a very exciting team. I'm looking forward to what they can do as they enter this new 12-team playoff era, and they can certainly, push towards that with this schedule.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.
Yay.